It wouldn't have been COP if the negotiations had been completed by last Friday, the last scheduled day of the conference. It was a long and drawn-out process that only ended when many negotiators were already with their suitcases packed and ready to fly out of Azerbaijan. The petrostate was the stage for the 29th United Nations Climate Change Conference, and expectations were high for a finance deal.
One of the greatest expectations was that we were trying to look forward to see how these people can move from promises, from agreement to action. And it has shown that they keep using the same language. When you pledge, doesn't mean that you've given.
The final deal came in the form of $1.3 trillion a year until 2035 in funds to developing nations. But only $300 billion of that will come in the form they mostly called for, grants and low-interest loans from the developed world.
And non-debt included to address a existing threat of climate change. When I say non-debt, we don't want it as loan, we don't want it as grant. It's supposed to go to the vulnerable people that are suffering from different countries.
As COP prepares to enter its third decade next year in Brazil, where do we go from here?
It now looks as if we are going for a yearly convention that doesn't have direction, that doesn't have a way of evaluating it. So the only way we can evaluate it is for us to make sure that all this funding, all these pledges, promise towards developing countries are being met.
From Friends of Europe, this is Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Villanova. If you haven't already, please take a moment now to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you're listening to this now to never miss an episode of Policy Voices. Today on the show, the promises and the letdowns of COP29 in Baku. I'm joined by Olumide Dow, the Executive Director of the International Climate Change Development Initiative Africa. Olumide is a climate activist from Nigeria, known on social media as Mr. Climate. I spoke with him just a few days after he left Baku, where he spent 2 weeks attending COP29. Here's my conversation with Olumide Dow, the Executive Director of International Climate Change Development Initiative Africa. Olumide, first of all, welcome to Policy Voices, and thank you so much for taking the time to join me in between your busy travel schedule. You just returned from COP that this year was held in Baku, Azerbaijan. How was the mood like during the negotiations, and how much did this shift throughout the 2 weeks?
Thank you very much for having me. I attended this COP based on a civil society angle, and I was there for the entire 2 weeks. The atmosphere of COP this year, we don't have much delegates. I can tell you that what we expected is not what we see. And it has been predicted by a lot of civil society organizations. But the bottom line is something was agreed, but with this agreement being able to fulfill is what is the bone of contention here. Because I remember in Paris Agreement, we had 100 billion. And up till now, there was no agreement on that. My attendance was to create collaboration, build partnership, and also look at a way of coming back home to implement something to based on our country target and area that Nigeria is looking at.
Can you talk a bit more about that, about the expectations going into the discussions? Were the expectations high and compared to what ended up happening?
One of the greatest expectations was that we were trying to look forward to see how these people can move from promises, from agreement to action. And it has shown that they keep using the same language. When you pledge, doesn't mean that you've given. There is something in my country that will say that if somebody promised you $100, if you have not received that money in your bank account, the money is not meant for you. So until that money is in your bank account, you can claim it. So our expectation was that we wanted to see a lot of pledges turning to implementation. We want to see how our NDC is going to translate into action back home. And for the NDC to translate into action, meaning that we need all those pledges to be done. I mentioned the 100 billion during the Paris. How do we know who collected the money? Who is holding the money? Nobody knows. It now looks as if we are going for a yearly convention that doesn't have direction, that doesn't have a way of evaluating it. So the only way we can evaluate it is for us to make sure that all this funding, all these pledges, promise towards developing countries are being met. I also remember very well that the African group of negotiators have been doing their own side of negotiation. But the bottom line here is that is Africa also ready in this context of negotiation? What we are negotiating for, how much follow up are we doing towards it? A lot of people have spent a lot of money to travel to Azerbaijan, and we are still leaving the conference with the hope that there is a number that shows up to us. But is the number going to turn to action on implementation of grant? And just so you know, when we say developing countries, there are countries that looks like they are developed, but they are still suffering from the consequences of this issue of climate change. So, but the bottom line here is how do we drive financial mechanisms, financial opportunities, funding for the vulnerable people? Because the people that we all go to Baku to fight for, they are there in local communities that don't even have access to see a plane before. And they say when two elephants are fighting, it's the grass that suffers. So you can see whether it's so-called our leaders that are making us to feel like this, or so-called politics in climate that is happening, then we need to start thinking and talk about, do we need to even continue COP, or everybody should just go and have their own problem, share problem, and solve it themselves?
And speaking of developing countries, there's a specific set of these developing countries that was very much of a sticking point during the negotiations. I'm speaking, of course, of countries such as China, India, and even Saudi Arabia, that under this framework are still considered as developing countries and therefore are not mandated to make financial contributions. What's your view on countries such as China, India, and Saudi Arabia still being viewed as developing countries?
The reason why I brought the issue of country that looks like developed or they are developing, the bottom line is, are they actually putting much, even in solving the problem from their own community, from their local entity? You see, this is the game of chess they are playing us. And countries that are supposed to pay for these consequences, they know themselves. And because they can leverage on countries that call themselves developed, but they are developing countries, they capitalize on those issues. And that is why you see, I think, is it Argentina that took back their negotiators? There's a lot of controversy, and people started saying that Africa should take back their negotiator. We are the one that something is pitching at leg. But those countries that you see that they are still calling themselves developing, to be sincere with you, you have to visit, you have to understand the context of where they are coming from, so that they'll be able to understand that you are living on a particular resources doesn't mean that you have it all. Nigeria as a country, as an example, we have abundant oil, but we are still suffering. We still have more than 50 million people that cannot have access to electricity, that cannot have access to good transportation. So the context here we should be looking at is that, how do we come to an agreement that is going to favor both global north, global south, and be able to see that all these consequences that we are facing, we'll be able to solve it internally amicably. There's a lot of aid coming from this so country that you call developed and developing country. Money coming from China to some country to support their agriculture and stuff like that. Where are they getting that money from if they are still counting themselves developed? But the bottom line is every country know one or two problems that is facing internally. And this issue are issues that we all need to discuss and talk about, so that we can have an agreement that will take us to somewhere. The $300 billion was not what was agreed before. It was something very low. I think 250 or so before they went back to another negotiation. So you see that there's need for dialogue, there's need for consultation. And this consultation will come with a lot of economic mindset. Because after all is said and done, If your economy is suffering, then you cannot be talking about climate change. Because in an economy that is very low, let me use my country, and you're telling them about climate change, you're telling them you are collecting warm money, or they will look at you, have not eaten, you are telling me about climate change. So the contexts are totally different from different. They say we are in the same boat, we are in the same water, but are we heading to the same place?
This was rightfully so called the finance COP. So let's talk about finances. You already mentioned some numbers that have been floating around, but just for our listeners, the final deal calls for developing nations to receive at least $1.3 trillion a year by 2035, but only $300 billion of that 1.3 trillion will come primarily in the form of grants and low interest loans from the so-called developed world. You called this finance deal a historically weak agreement that feels like a setback for climate action. Why is that?
Countries are calling for 1.3, right? But the point here is I'm in support, but I just want us to sit back as a developing country and ask ourselves, how do we hold our leaders accountable if this money gets to us? And we should stop listening to promises. They have been promising us since Paris Agreement. It is not going to happen again and again and again. And that's why I said COP is now like a yearly convention, or let's say a vacation period. And it's very, very important that all these financial mechanisms, whether it's World Bank that is going to host the fund, whether it's the Green Climate Fund, the bottom line here is who share the money, who collects the money. How do you and I tap into that fund and make use of it for the people that are suffering? This financial COP was supposed to be a conversation that is bringing resources to the people on ground, that is solving renewable energy issue from fossil fuel, that is solving flooding issue in different countries, that is solving disaster risk reduction, that is solving food insecurity. But you see what is going on? Our ocean is being taken away daily, daily, and daily. And the people that are causing all these things might not understand what we are facing on ground. Making it a financial COP and not stick with that price the civil society were asking for is a sort of failed COP to me, because the negotiation have come to an end. People were in the midnight everywhere. But you remember the collective quantified goal, which was released and is profoundly disappointing. Totally. Why are we still calling it a COP of climate finance? Because there was a reason for it. It's for it to raise the expectation of the vulnerable communities, particularly from Africa. And it was seen as a beacon of hope, especially on the ever exclusive climate finance agenda in the likes of Africa and its our allies within the G77 and climate negotiation blocks are clear on the demand, very clear, like you said, on the 1.3 trillion quantum of climate finance that is needed, that have an additional or predictable grant base and non-debt included to address existing threat of climate change. When I say non-debt, we don't want it as loan, we don't want it as grant. It's supposed to go to the vulnerable people that are suffering from different countries. And so it is disheartening that just few hours before COP29 finish, they did not even agree on the most awaited NCQG that's supposed to be done. And the paragraph 6 of the text, which also actually estimated cost need in the national determined contribution of developing countries about 5 to 6 trillion up to 2030. Based on this, do we still call it COP of climate finance, or we call it COP of bad financial conversation?
The discussions were held mostly on the issue of numbers. There was first the number of 250 that was then raised to 300. But hearing you speak now, you don't seem to be so concerned on if the number is 1.3 or something else, but more if countries like your own country will ever see this money and which form it will take. Is that true?
No. I'm concerned. I'm just saying that the more we concern, the more we should be able to account for everything that is being given to us. I'm coming from a corrupt country. We cannot entrust one quarter of that money into our leaders' hand, and everything is looking the way it is. It has not come to like Africa is begging, and we are not. We are seeking for our rights. But for me, I support the $1.3 trillion. But what I'm trying to say is that how do we make sure when this opportunity comes, how do we make sure that everybody is being carried along, it's being spent well, and it's being able to solve environmental challenges that we're facing?
And what does this money mean in practice for emerging nations when this $1.3 trillion is finally handed to developing nations? What will this mean? Are we still in the realm of adaptation or mitigation?
Adaptation, adaptation. Mitigation is expensive. And if we cannot adapt now to what we can do now, how do we get to that goal to mitigate? Even though mitigation is a very complex and relative word to use, but what's going to happen to technology? Nigeria, we have a lot of initiative, and because of technology, a lot of actions doesn't move well in the country.
Do you think that the goal of 1.5 degrees is still alive?
Definitely, we will continue to push for that. But as it is now, that 1.5 has been threatened because our right is not that it's taken away, has not been given back to us because we are the receiving and we are suffering. So 1.5 for me, I still see it alive, and we should do more in advocating for that.
I want to shift gears a bit now as we head towards the end of our conversation. And since you were in Baku, you were present where the negotiations were taking place, I'm really curious to know how much did Trump's victory shape the discussions? I have to imagine that it did, and the shadow of Trump for sure shaped the discussions in the sense that there was this urgency to get things done this year, but also at the same time not over promising on what could not be delivered in a year's time?
Yeah, Trump matter is so pathetic when it comes to his stand on climate change. If Trump were to advocate for policy that is focusing on fossil fuel or let's say prioritizing economic growth over environmental regulation, it might lead to a lot of significant debates, within the context of the conference. But we can see that assuming he was in COP, we should have seen a lot of reaction from his state. But his approach could either galvanize support from like-minded countries or provoke some strong opposition from nations prioritizing certain things and leaving other things. But let me tell you, if I want to tell you about this issue of Trump, I will tell you that Trump doesn't even have, I might not know, I'm saying this from my mind, does he even have the knowledge of climate change? If he does, then he will see the need for him to fight for a certain particular thing. Recently, is it 2 or 3 days ago, he has started dishing out all his plans for climate change. And this guy is going to do it. It's time. We just concentrate on what matters and stop updating ourselves on what to do and what not to do. But for the issue of Trump, I respect him as a leader, and when he talks, he do. But this one is working on might be a blow, might be a pathetic story for him.
In the very real absence of the US as a self described global leader starting already from January, who do you think will fill in their shoes already, for example, at next year's COP?
We all know the developed countries, right? So I may not know, but I'm sure the developed countries will be responsible because who knows what's going to happen next year. Maybe Trump might decide to be back. But as of now, I may not be able to say this person will, but what I know is that developing countries that have been speaking, talking together, having day in, day out meeting, they'll be the best person to come in.
And next year's COP will be in Brazil. How much faith do you have in President Lula da Silva? And, if you can already start naming the priorities, as this year was the finance COP, what should the world be focusing on next year?
I think next year COP, a lot of people will not attend that COP. I'm not prophesying, I'm just saying, because it has turned to a waste of time. It has turned to a waste of time. And I don't know whether there is a need for me to go to somewhere and couldn't make an impact. Brazil, I'm looking forward to see more financial commitments, not promise, not pledge, something that translates to investment opportunities. So I think also next year, there will be more voices that will speak to what happened this year. So we just need to start looking at, okay, our agenda based on the African group of negotiators, how do we need to tailor it so that it can capture all the issues, all the essence of the continent of Africa? So our African group of negotiators will now know what they can negotiate on our behalf. So Brazil is going to happen and people will still go, but we will not have a lot of people there because they don't want to continue with the same story day in, day out.
But then let me just ask you this. If not COP, then what?
If not COP, a lot of countries will be going for aids, like international support, aids to solve some certain problem. And if not COP, every continent now needs to sit up and try local solution that can resonate with the people. I think that would be the best way to go.
So better than COP, you would advocate for a more individualistic based solution rather than countries coming together, as hypocritical as it may be, to try to find a common solution for a global problem?
We have been coming together for years. What happens? Is there any outcome? From Kyoto Protocol to National Determined Contribution to all the conferences that we made. What comes out from there? I advocate for local-driven solution that will attract these people who want to come and invest.
And that's it for today's episode of Policy Voices. If you want to comment on this episode, you can search for Friends of Europe on LinkedIn and X or send us an email. Our address is press@friendsofeurope.org. I'm Catarina Villanova and I'll be with you again next week. Until then, goodbye.